It's day 3 of the Republican National Convention. Donald Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, will be delivering remarks.
This comes after a number of speakers have already made headlines, including Sean O'Brien. The president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters delivered a speech on Monday night.
We will create an agenda and work with a bipartisan coalition ready to accomplish something real for the American worker.
O'Brien did not endorse Trump, but he did call for labor reform. And joining us now is Wayne State University Associate Professor Jeremy Malloy. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. So O'Brien's prominence at the RNC really does highlight just how important the labor vote is this November, particularly in pivotal swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Why are unionized workers crucial to American democracy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely they are, Meredith. And I think, Sean O'Brien's invitation reflects that. Unions play a fundamental role in American democracy. I know that during this election and over the past several years, a lot of people in American life have been very concerned about the future of American democracy. We've seen things like the January 6th insurrection and worries about, a creeping authoritarian, anti-democratic presence. And it's important to remember that that's what President Roosevelt was worried about in the 1930s during the New Deal, when he elected, to push forward with the Wagner Act and have unions be encouraged as a factor in American life. Because unions, at their best, and certainly not always the case, as we know, but at their best, unions are powerful democratic institutions. They're where ordinary people learn how to participate in a democracy, not just pulling a lever every 4 years and walking away, but governing an institution, practicing leadership, debating ideas, pushing forward a shared vision. And it's, in the union movement that a lot of Americans learn to flex those democratic muscles. And moreover, this is a really important time for unions. We've seen there's 14 million union members in the US. Most of them, are voters. And in the past couple of years, unions are rising. We see increased number of strikes, increased number of organizations. And because of that, I think both parties are anxious to court organized labor. And, we've seen President Biden come here to be on the UAW picket line. We've seen Teamster President O'Brien speak at the Republican National Convention. And so I think both parties are trying to reach out to organized labor, but it's imperative that unionized workers and organized labor also really understand the stakes in this election and what's both parties are actually promising to do for or against workers.
It makes sense that those candidates would be focusing on those groups, Jeremy. We know that the Teamsters in the past have endorsed Republican presidential candidates, but a union president has never spoken at the RNC before now. Can you speak more to that move and also what's at stake for them in this election?
Absolutely, Terrence. Thank you. So I understand why the Republican Party would be interested in having Sean O'Brien speak. The Teamsters did very well in their last contract. They're a big union. They represent a lot of Americans in key states that the Republicans want to reach out to. And notably, the Republican Party has a record of being against unionization in the last several decades, being against the right to strike, being against occupational health and safety laws, a lot of things that workers and unions have traditionally fought for. So for them, the fact that President O'Brien would be willing to speak and give kind of a bit of a gloss of pro-worker sentiment to the Republican Party makes sense. I think President O'Brien is making a very big miscalculation from a workers' advocacy perspective in appearing. And I think he betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of where workers' power comes from. Presidents and conventions on both sides, this is the first time at a Republican convention, but at a Democratic convention have had union leaders speak. But the question is, they're not usually in the room when the key decisions are made about platforms and policies. Union power has never come from the ability to speak to powerful people. It's been to disrupt power in America by workers withholding their labor, right? The sit-down strikes that the UAW ran that launched the American middle class, those were won by their ability to disrupt GM production. It was not because they went and spoke at FDR's campaign or at Herbert Hoover's campaign. So it makes a lot of sense for the Republican Party. It's definitely a puzzling move for Sean O'Brien. I think that a lot of his members have already spoken out and been unhappy with.
And we've been talking about the RNC, but after the major auto worker strike, which you just mentioned and we covered extensively here in Michigan, how do you think that influenced unionized workers' view of President Biden here locally?
Obviously President Biden has a fight on his hands here in Michigan for a lot of issues, but certainly compared to past presidents, I think a lot of unionized workers, especially in the UAW, see him as a more reliable ally who's willing to do more for workers. For example, there's the symbolic. President Biden came to be on the UAW picket line, and I think that's an interesting comparison to President O'Brien. Getting a sitting president to come be at your event and at your picket line, I believe, shows power. Whereas going to another person's party and speaking is maybe a nice line on the resume, but probably doesn't show that you have a lot of leverage with them. But also, these symbolic gestures are only really important if they're backed up by actual action. And so, things that President Biden has done for labor in terms of especially being through Jennifer Abruzzo's head of the National Labor Relations Board, a lot more proactive about fighting a lot of the employer shenanigans that go on during union elections. The National Labor Relations Board has been much more serious about doing what it was supposed to do, which is to protect fair labor elections for unions and to protect that when union workers have a desire in America to unionize, that desire is protected. Because if polls have consistently shown for decades, a lot more Americans want a union than actually have one, and a big reason they haven't is because employers have routinely broken the law during union elections. President Biden, one thing that he has done is put a bit more teeth in those to make union elections fair. So I think there's a lot of different reasons that union members vote. We tend to look at workers as just workers, but a lot in this election are workplace issues. Climate change affects workers because they have to work in extreme heat, like the Teamsters in trucks with no air conditioning. Reproductive justice and reproductive rights, which is a big issue for many female voters, is also a workplace issue, right? It affects women's ability to participate fully in the labor market. When we see a lot of the attacks on transgender folks and gay folks, that it doesn't just affect them outside of the workplace. That affects their ability to earn a living, their ability to have just treatment in the workplace. And certainly Governor Whitmer here has been alive to that in her passing protective legislation. That was not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because she is, I believe, looking to attract, skilled workers to Michigan who are looking for a fair deal on and off the job. So there are a lot of important issues at stake for workers in this election, and I think they go beyond what we consider traditional bread and butter and unionization issues, although those are, of course, important too.
There is a lot at stake. Jeremy, thank you for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.